Hello, psychos. Social psychology, or how to create your own doomsday cult, part one, is what we're covering today. And yeah, it gets a little ugly here. There's some amazing social forces that overwhelm people's individual personalities to the point that it makes them do things they wouldn't normally do. And that gets compounded when you throw a bunch of those individuals together with these social forces. So let's first, before we dive into some of the key elements of how to create your own doomsday cult, let's look at a case of such with Jonestown. And as you watch this video clip, I want you to consider what social psychological kind of forces might have contributed to the mass suicides there, where one day almost 1,000 people committed suicide because the preacher, Jim Jones, told them to. If you don't know anything about this case, back in the 70s, they were a church, I believe, in California. Eventually, step by step, they sold their possessions. They became more and more committed to him, the leader. And then eventually they moved to Guyana and built a little compound in the jungle, to isolate themselves from the modern world. And they were being investigated by the FBI for some stuff. Anyway, some things happened, and eventually they put cyanide in the Kool-Aid, they lined up, and they drank it. So that old expression, drinking the Kool-Aid, which basically means joining a cause or conforming to some atrocious act, that's really where it comes from. Check out this news clip. This is not for the squeamish, by the way.
Been kept locked up by the temple leaders to make it difficult for anyone to leave the country on the premises.
That is bodies
Jewelry,
you're seeing.
Social security checks. A trunk was filled with performed today on the body of the founder of the People's Temple, Jim Jones. His sons were simply going to sleep. Some had pillows beneath their heads. Some died alone, separated by families until the end. Babies were fed the lethal potion it's believed each lived about 5 minutes after swallowing a mixture of cyanide and a flavor. Protective custody by the Guyana police. Another arrest was made today.
So some got away, but this was by choice by many. Jim Jones himself was among them, and so we have to ask, what do you think happened here that contributed to this? So consider that. Things like a powerful leader, somebody to stir up their religious fervor. Also the isolation. They cut themselves off from, and this is pretty typical of cults, to cut themselves off from the modern world in some way. The leader then has more control of them. The fact that others were already lining up at the Kool-Aid, that's huge. You don't want to be different. That sense of conformity, that urge to conform is very powerful and can overpower our individual decision making. So conformity could be one too. Factors of obedience, we learned from Milgram perhaps, as we'll see, may have been a factor too. So let's look at some of the things that contributed to this, because here's the deal. When you look into the profiles of these individuals who joined this cult and moved away and did all this, you find that it could have been you. It could have been your neighbor. These people are not freaks necessarily. There's some other forces going on that overpower their individuality. So charismatic leadership is one, and there's no doubt that people like what you're seeing here, Hitler. But we could also include Martin Luther King. We could include Gandhi. We could include Trump among these. We're not passing a judgment on these people. We're saying that they are leaders who had a charismatic style of leadership that had a great deal of influence on the masses to do things maybe beyond what those individuals would have chosen to have done. So one of the pioneers in social psychology was Kurt Lewin. L for Lewin, L for leadership. His big study was in leadership. He was concerned about leadership because he was a Jewish psychologist who escaped Nazi Germany during the Holocaust, came to the United States, and one of his big studies was concerned with, how could this guy with a funny mustache, take control of their whole culture from which he came and move the people toward mass exterminating Jewish people and others. So he was very much concerned with that. In the research, just generally speaking, he created, working with kids in three, randomly assigned to three groups. The children were working on projects and supervised by three different leaders. So three different leadership styles. That's the independent variable. One leadership style was authoritarian, totalitarian, dictator. Do this, do it this way, do it exactly like I say. A second leadership style was more of a laissez-faire, like, hey, you kids do whatever, I'll be over here reading the newspaper. So the guy's falling asleep in the corner and the kids are just a bunch of animals. And then the third case was the democratically led. Like, hey, okay, so how should we proceed with this project? Let's vote. Okay, we can do it that way. Okay, let's go. So democratically led. And what they found was, it's also interesting because they would stage it so that the leader is called out of the classroom. He's got a phone call, he leaves, and then they watch to see what happens when the kids, the subjects, are left alone. Through mirrored glass, they found three different responses. Those that are totalitarian led or dictator led, they found that they stopped working. They needed to be micromanaged. They were used to being told exactly, precisely what to do. So they got stuff done though. The laissez-faire group, they just didn't, even while he's there, didn't progress much. And when he's gone, they didn't progress any either. The democratically led bunch, they continued to work when the guy left. They were also more creative. There's this sense of ownership in the project. You chose it. You chose to go this or that way with it. So you're willing to take risks and take chances. And that sense of ownership and autonomy that people have contributes to creative responses. So, but yeah, they continued to work even when he was there because it's not the leader's project, it's theirs. There's that sense of ownership. Anyway, that was one of the findings there. But the point is that's a pioneering study in social psychology that Lewin did. So some other things that contribute to sort of leadership factors, especially in this case too, mere exposure effect, they call it. What they found is being exposed to something makes you more familiar with it. And the more you're familiar with it, the more you're attracted to it. It's kind of like these signs that you see around the time when there's some sort of election going on with a city. There's signs all over, littering every corner of every street, it seems. People will actually vote just because they're familiar. They've heard the name before even. And it works even with like faces too. You're familiar. Oh, I've seen Trump before. I've heard of this guy before, or whoever. So the more familiar you are, just by being exposed to it, even subconsciously. And this is kind of how like product placement in movies works, where even having a Coca-Cola in the background, subconsciously, mere exposure, you don't even have to have it in your face, makes us more familiar with it and therefore more attracted to it. We're more comfortable with it because of that exposure. Attraction, speaking of attraction, something about this, just a little side point, I'm not talking about cult leaders necessarily, but do you think it's true to say birds of a feather flock together or opposites attract? Which, you've heard both phrases when it comes to two people being attracted to each other. Which one is more accurate according to research? And the answer, based on what I just said, birds of a feather flock together. We are more attracted to similarity and familiarity. Things that are strange to us, we're leery of, I should say. So we hesitate. So it's interesting, they find this in attraction studies as well. People tend to be of the same interests, same political views, religious values, socioeconomic level, like all these factors tend to be the same race, typically. So there's this similarity. The matching hypothesis, they sometimes call it, when it comes to romantic attraction. People just kind of like gravitate toward those who are very similar to them, and they're happier, they found. Now there are exceptions you could probably think of where she's so out of his league, but those are exceptions that stand out and they're salient examples in your mind, but typically it's birds of a feather flock together, not opposites attract. Another thing about leadership, back to that, or attraction I should say, is the halo effect. With the halo effect, think halo like an angel, right? Halo over the head, so good, angelic kind of qualities. What they have found is people will when somebody's when they see one quality in a person, they tend to assume that encompasses the whole person. So if a person is more attractive, people will assume that that person is also more moral, more intelligent, possibly more like mature, like all these other angelic qualities that sort of trickle down from just that one trait, when it may not at all be the case. The halo effect, they call it. So we tend to be more like they find this in classrooms, sadly. One kid may be assumed to be more intelligent and mature and all this when based on one assumption, about a trait that kid may have. So it emanates out to other characteristics of that student or child. So anyway, those are aspects of characteristics of charismatic leadership. Certainly with a cult leader, all cults have to have that leader. Somebody's got to be there that does this. They stir up people's passions, their anger, their hatred, their frustrations, and that's precisely what happened in the case of the people we quoted earlier. There's certain emotions that those charismatic leaders tapped into and rallied the people to them and moved them toward good or bad ends, depending on your perspective. Obedience is huge. Now, blindly following orders. The question, a lot of this comes in the aftermath of World War II. And in the aftermath of World War II, they rounded up a lot of Nazis and then put them on trial, the Nuremberg trials, they call them. And they're like, why did you, kill these people in the chamber, mass exterminating people in the Holocaust? And the answer is, I'm a soldier. I was just following orders. Obedience is what soldiers are supposed to do. And of course, the name you need to remember here is Stanley Milgram. Milgram is the most famous social psychologist there was. In the 60s, he took this stuff to a whole new level. He wanted to see how far that goes. What can you do to apply pressures and cause people to obey orders, even if those orders go against their personal ethics and decision making? And so basically he had people come in. He lied to them. Here's the blindness part of the study. He tells the subject, thank you for volunteering. We're testing, the effects of punishment on memory and learning. That's a lie. So that's what they tell them. And this other guy, the other volunteer here who's here, is either going to be the teacher or the learner, and you're going to be the teacher or the learner. And one of you is going to have to memorize a bunch of lists of stuff, and then you're going to be placed in this room and hooked up to an electrical device, and the teacher is going to have to read through the microphone in this other room, and the learner is going to have to buzz in A, B, C, or D, their answers to each one. And for each one you get wrong, whichever one of you is the learner will get an electric shock. Now the thing is, it's progressive. So with each one that learner misses, the shock gets more and more intense, all the way up to 450 volts on this little contraption you're looking at. Well, then the two volunteers draw to see who's going to be the teacher and who's going to be the learner. Well, that's rigged because the subject is going to be the teacher administering electric shocks. The other volunteer is actually a Confederate or stooge. They sometimes call him an actor who's pretending to be a subject, but actually is, pretending to get electric shocks in the next room. Now, please understand, they're not really. So they set it all up, and they start going to it, and the guy is reading, things through there, and the actor in the next room is answering back, and occasionally, at certain points, he starts missing questions as he's been trained to, and then pretends to get shocked. So check this out, just to give you a little sample of what we're talking about.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learner. Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go in. Let me out.
He refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor, and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Ow! I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, is there? I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering with less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
Yeah, so we're all potential Nazis in this case. Well, not all of us, 2/3 of us. So how far would people go in blindly following those orders? I should add, there's a few other things here. At a certain point, the guy in the next room becomes eerily silent. He's not even buzzing in anymore. And you're like, well, he's missing questions. The experimenter says, insist that you continue, follow through to the end. And people do. They're shocking a dead body in the next room, they guess. It's important to note that 2/3 of subjects, even when they've replicated this study since the 60s, 2/3 go all the way to 450 volts or are willing to. Yeah. So these days you couldn't do this sort of experiment, but it's very revealing about potential horrible acts toward others just because you're following orders. The McDonald's hoax, I won't click on that one, just to let you know, this happens in real life. This is not just in a laboratory experiment. There was a case of a guy who would prank call fast food places, McDonald's, and after scoping it out, he would identify somebody, and he would pretend to be police, and he would start giving orders to the manager to take one of the girls working there back in the back room and strip search her. A lot of people would follow the orders. These people working at McDonald's that were managers would carry out the orders, and the employee who's accused of stealing something is also carrying out the orders of the manager. So it's like somebody's giving orders to somebody giving orders, and it all comes from some guy on a phone who's pretending to be police. Anyway, it's crazy stuff, and so it does happen. In one case, there was a major lawsuit. I think eventually they did find the guy who was making the calls. But people follow orders, sadly, and to atrocious ends. I should mention before we go on, there are several other things you could tweak in this. I want you to consider if you were on the research team of Stanley Milgram, what would you do, like to tweak it, to take this to the next level? Let's try this variable, let's try that variable to see if we can increase or decrease obedience. And part of it has to do with it was on the campus of Yale University, so it was very prestigious. When they took it somewhere else, like a coffee shop or something, obedience dropped. The way the guy's dressed in a lab coat and stuff makes a difference. So there's this sense of authority and obedience. And when you tweak that, it caused a drop in the obedience. Also, if you're looking at the person being shocked, they had actors actually, be seen and wince in pain. You can actually see your victim, and the obedience dropped in that case too. So you can just think creatively. What are other kinds of variables you would tweak to see a drop in obedience in the case of Milgram's obedience study? Conformity is huge. Now, Stanley Milgram, his teacher was Solomon Asch. So let's go back to the 50s a little bit. Asch was interested in similar topics like conformity. Again, in the aftermath of World War II, how is it that a whole culture of people would good, decent German culture, with a long history of, a beautiful culture could be swayed and captured by, the power of Hitler's charismatic leadership style. So conformity is part of the equation here too. If you're going to have your Doomsday cult, you got to have obedience, but you also have to have them behaving like sheep. sheep-like conformity behavior. So back in the 50s, Solomon Asch studied this in a very interesting way. Check it out.
The Asch experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research.
Social psychology, yep.
A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1. 1.
1.
Two.
1.
Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3. 3.
3.
3.
The Asch experiment has been repeated many times, and the results have been supported again and again.
So yeah, he buckled after the first round. So how can you put pressure on people to conform to a obviously wrong answer? It's, 2 + 2 is 5 kind of stuff. I mean, it's so obviously not the answers they were given. Here's an important question. What did Asch do to increase conformity by the subject? What are things that were going on there that increased it? And again, if you were on Asch's research team, what would you do to tweak a variable to see if there was an increase or drop in conformity? And they did in later replications. So they found that for one, they're all giving the same answer. They're unanimous in their wrong answer. Line 1, line 1, line 1. Okay, line 1. So they're unanimous. They're not giving different wrong answers. And that's a factor, that they're unanimous. The sheep are all running off the same cliff, so to speak. Another factor is the number of confederates, the number of actors. If there were only 2, it wasn't quite enough. 3 gets you there, 4, 5, you're going to start conforming then. That's a big one. They found that also if you instructed one of the actors to actually give the right answer, it caused a significant drop in conformity. It takes just one brave person to go against the herd before they run off the cliff and say, nah, not going to do it, to cause a significant drop in conformity. One dissenter, that's the word I'm after. One person dissenting against the herd, so to speak. So yeah, there's probably other factors you can think. Think of other variables that would cause a drop in conformity if you've tweaked it or changed it. The fact that they're all about the same age, they're not like a bunch of old men squinting at the lines, so they have credibility and such. So those are all factors that can contribute to this conformity by, Nazis or Jim Jones followers and such. Before there was reality TV, the original reality TV show was Candid Camera back in the 60s. And this is not psychologists, but they were doing TV shows where they would hide a camera and mess with people. It's kind of like What Would You Do, if y'all are familiar with that. And this is the original one back in the 60s. I'm going to show you a very interesting one where the actors stand backwards on an elevator to see if the next person that steps on the elevator will conform. Check it out. People will do crazy things if the herd is doing it.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the Candid Camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First, he makes a full turn to the rear, and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door. Everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Yep. So here's the takeaway. I would say the most powerful force in the entire universe, social psychologists have revealed, is the urge to fit in. It is immensely powerful. People would rather fit in than be right. And people do absurd things just to fit in, ridiculous things, and believe realities that may not be real and based in fact. And you can see it all around you. Just look at the political situation that is our situation lately. It's the power, the urge to fit in, and then finding your in-group gives you a sense of identity, and it's huge and overpowers your individuality in other ways. The urge to fit in is very powerful. Now, speaking of, groupthink is one more term we want to address here. It's kind of conformity, but it's conformity of mind, not just behavior, conformity of mind in a way. What they have, it's basically withholding your disagreement or your independent thought, biting your tongue for the sake of getting along with the herd. So this is dangerous in jury situations, for example, where maybe you haven't heard all the evidence, but it's almost lunchtime and they're like, guilty, guilty, guilty. You're like, wait, okay, guilty. Some dangerous, crazy stuff has happened because of groupthink. It's dangerous. You don't want a bunch of yes men if you're a CEO of a company. People saying, yes, Mr. President or Mrs. President, yes, yes, and agreeing with you. You need people to discuss and be the devil's advocate and keep you on your toes and like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't invade Cuba, if y'all know about the Bay of Pigs that JFK was involved in. Or maybe we shouldn't launch the space shuttle Challenger because we're not quite sure if it's ready. But yes, 3, 2, 1, okay, let's go. And boom, so groupthink can lead to some dangerous things. You need to have critical thinkers and challenge your yes men, yes women, people conforming in thought. So that is part 1 of how to create your own doomsday cult. You need charismatic leadership at the core of it, who then manipulates the social environment, which is huge, very powerful. You need to get them to obey. So you need to establish your authority and leadership to cause them to obey to orders that they wouldn't otherwise, and take them down the road step by step by step to drink the Kool-Aid. Now, they didn't drink the Kool-Aid on day 1. It's a foot in the door kind of thing, drip, 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 and little by little, eventually they're ready to drink the cyanide Kool-Aid. And you need conformity. They wearing uniforms and such, behaving the same way like sheep, and then they're putty in your hands. All right, tomorrow, part 2 of how to create your own doomsday cult.